Okay, we are in lesson number 11 if you've got the book. If you don't got the book, we'll be in John chapter 11 and also a little bit of John chapter 5 because I like it. Right? So that was what you texted me the other day. How long could you teach on John chapter 5? The rest of the year anyway. Yeah, that's a chapter that'll do it. And I've talked enough about some of these topics we're going to cover today between my Easter sermon and some other things. I may just have you guys teach the class today. I'll ask you the questions, and you're supposed to repeat back things I've already said to you. We'll see how we do. We'll start out, though, by reading, let me just read a little bit out of John chapter 11 first. This is John chapter 11. I'll read 1 through 44. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair. His brother Lazarus was ill. So the sister sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. That's a funny pair of sentences to me. Come back to that. Then after this, he said to the disciples, Let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and you're going to go there again. Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him. After saying these things, he said to them, Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him. The disciples said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover. Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant taking rest and sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died, and for your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. So Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, Let us also go, that we may die with him. Now when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, but Mary remained seated in the house. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. Jesus said to her, Your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world. When she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying in private, The teacher is here and is calling for you. And when she heard it, she rose quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary rise quickly and go out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, Where have you laid him? And they said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. So the Jews said, See how he loved him. But some of them said, Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying? Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, Take away the stone. Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead for days. Jesus said to her, Did I not tell you that if you believe, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. And Jesus lifted his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, they may believe that you sent me. When he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The man who had died came out, his hands and his feet bound with linen strips, and his face wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, unbind him, and let him go. Then if you read the rest of the chapter, people are unhappy about it. Another story for another day. So, that passage is unique. It's only in John's Gospel that you get the Lazarus story. In fact, did anyone even catch the bit, little nugget of trivia? There is a tradition that maybe when the book of John says the disciple whom Jesus loved, it doesn't mean John, it means Lazarus. Now, I don't think that's right, but it's based on verse 3, Lord, he whom you love is ill. All right, so the only person identified in this book as the one you love is actually Lazarus. But I don't think that's what it means, but it's just a curiosity for what it's worth in verse 3.
Could be Martha or Mary.
There's a lot of people that Jesus loves, right? Yeah. So, yeah, I think it might be a mistake to identify it with one person in particular. But anyway, neither here nor there. It's definitely a story that's a prelude to Jesus' own resurrection. And so it's unique in some ways, and very much like other stories and others, that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all tell stories about overcoming death. That's an important theme. Where this story comes up the most in the life of the average Christian person is probably in funerals. So we had a funeral here this morning. Okay, so hit close to home for a moment. If you listen to preachers do funerals, you'll find out that we're not overly creative. I'll just be perfectly honest with you. I'm very careful not to plagiarize sermon material, except funerals and weddings and a prayer if I need one. Because there's a whole lot of funerals and there's a whole lot of weddings, and I'm just not that clever. And so I often refer to the Book of Common Prayer, which is, I don't know, old as the Church of England, I guess. It's been around a long time in some version or another. And it has fairly old English prayers. And then if you're Anglican, it tells you how to do the whole service, right? It says, here's how to appoint a bishop, and here's how to do the whole thing. I haven't found those sections exceptionally helpful, but the bit on how to do a funeral, it has some great stuff. Also in the wedding section, for what it's worth. The other day I did Jaylee and Jason's wedding, and somebody came up to me and said, that was a beautiful prayer you said. Where'd you get that? And you come up with that? Nope, stole it right out of the book. It says, this is how you say the wedding prayer, and that's the one I do. So I'm not real creative about those. I use the one that people have been saying in churches for hundreds of years. My wedding sermon even begins, dearly beloved, right? I mean, it comes right out of the book. You don't even invent anything. But the Book of Common Prayer also lists a handful of passages with each little section and says, if you're doing a funeral, here are some appropriate verses to read. And guess what some of those are? Okay. John 11, and another passage we'll talk about today in John 5, which makes you think that for hundreds of years now, quite longer than that, but for at least hundreds of years now, how many funerals have had those same words read? There are some texts that when I read in the Bible, I think about that. How many times has Psalm 23 been read at a funeral? How many times? And I'm not making fun of that. I'm saying that there's like this richness to it, that those words work. And this is one of those stories that does this, because it touches at a place that's very deep within the Christian heart when it comes to talking about death. Bud did the service today, and Bud has, again, his kind of routine about death. I've almost got it memorized. I was poking fun at him a little bit. I said, all right, death is like three things, but I always forget the third one, and then he reminds me. But there's some things that just these words are comforting, and they work, and so we don't invent the wheel. You know what I mean? John 5 is the other passage. I didn't read it, so I'll read it now. This is John 5, 24 through 27. Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life. He does not come into judgment, but has passed from death to life. Truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming and is now here, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. For as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son also to have life in himself. And he has given him authority to execute judgment because he is the Son of Man. There's some really rich stuff in those 2 or 3 sentences, and we want to talk about a little bit of it today. Death is, without that background of Christian thinking on death, death is a dark topic to talk about. You want to have a really uncomfortable conversation with your family, start talking about, now when I die, and it gets awkward in a hurry. When I visited my mother that Wednesday, one of the Wednesdays Colin covered for me, got to go up and she's in the isolation room. At that time, she's home now and doing great, by the way. But at that time, she was in the isolation room and not really sure she was going to make it. And I'm there to try to comfort her. So, of course, what she does is start to tell me about the things she wants at her funeral, which is super comforting for me, right? You know, I'm just really struggling, you know, but here it is. And I've had the same kind of moment with Celine, kind of in the midst of chemo, when things were a little bit bleak. She said, I'm feeling pretty good today. Do you want to go for a walk? I said, yeah, that'd be great. That'd be, you know, release some tension and relax a little bit. We get about half a block down the street, and she says, so here's what I'm thinking about dying. Well, there went any relaxation. This was not a peaceful walk anymore. Because the last thing I wanted to think about was her dying, right? I was doing my best to think about anything else. Thinking about yourself dying is unpleasant, but people you love dying just makes it worse. And humans in modern life are even worse. It's something I'll say, as the world has gotten more modern, we've gotten worse at, not better. The ancient world, by necessity, was better acquainted with death. People died younger. There was less medical help when you got sick. Even in the medieval era, where was the cemetery? Next to the church, right? I mean, you literally passed your loved ones every Sunday morning, right? Now we kind of put it somewhere out in the pasture somewhere and surround it with a fence and try to keep it, you know, out of sight, out of mind. We prefer death to happen in a hospital, in kind of a clinical environment. You know, that's a very different way of thinking about it, and we just do whatever we can to not think about dying in the modern world. And that's a problem. But the fact that death is dreary is not new. Psalm 23:4 refers to it as the valley of the shadow of death. If this were a class on the Old Testament instead of John, I would say that in the Hebrew Scriptures, if anything, it's even a more grim view of death. So there are a few passages in the Old Testament that hint at the idea of people living again, but it's not spelled out like in clear New Testament detail, Jesus is risen and so will you kind of language. It's kind of hints and glimpses. Job asked it as a question. If a man die, will he live again? And he seems to think, yeah, probably, but he doesn't seem like as emphatic as Paul is. And so death is thought of as kind of the gloomy end. In fact, if you read Ecclesiastes, the big point about death there is it's the great equalizer. If you're poor, you die, and you're worm food. If you're rich, you die, and you're worm food, right? That's the Ecclesiastes on death right there. And that's where he gets to those great statements. Vanity of vanities, all is vanities. Why? Because you're all going to die. Right? Pretty grim. And it's our oldest enemy. When you come out of the garden, I mean, what's the real enemy in the story of the fall of man? We could talk about the serpent. Yep, he's a troublemaker. We could talk about sin. But, you know, the real lasting consequence that comes at the end of that story is you were with life and now you are with death. And you're going to stay there. 1 Corinthians 15 says the last enemy that will be destroyed is death. It's the first and it's the last to go. Okay? So we've been around it a long time, and it's not comfortable, and it doesn't get any easier in some ways. In my Easter sermon, I talked a little bit about Isaiah 25 and verse 7, where the prophet called death the shroud that is cast over all peoples, the veil that is spread over all nations. What do you think of that metaphor? I preached about it See what you think about it. What do you think of that metaphor, of the idea, I mean, is that grim or what? Of there's this burial shroud over all the human race, and you're just all waiting for the grave. That'll run your day. But that seems to be the imagery of that verse. Followed with, in verse 8, God will someday, doesn't say when, someday, swallow up death forever and wipe away tears from all faces. Again, does that just spell out, and the dead will be raised? It doesn't say it like that. It just says, well, death will lose, and we'll stop crying. So it's a hint, but it doesn't really spell it out. So, when we get to the New Testament in stories like John, it's interesting how this really turns, and death stops being this bully that we're stuck with, and starts being a problem that can actually be defeated. And John 11 is an example of this. So, just to summarize what we read a moment ago, John tells us of the death of a friend of Jesus named Lazarus. Lazarus was the brother of Mary and Martha, all people who have been close to Jesus. Okay? So it's not just a death, it's the death of someone close to Jesus, which has a little poignancy to it. After the death of her brother Lazarus, of Mary and Martha's brother, not her, anyway, pronouns, Jesus traveled to the home of Lazarus as family and friends often do at the time of a loved one's death. This is really very familiar to us, right? Someone dies, and what we do, family gathers in. Literally saw that today in our building. So, Jesus makes this statement to Martha in verse 23. Your brother will rise again. Okay. So what I want us to think about just for a minute, what did Jesus mean and what did Martha hear? I think it was Bertrand Russell who said, the greatest problem with communication is the assumption that you did it. That quite often we say something and we assume, you know what I meant, right? And the other person says, uh-huh, and no, there's no. So what does Jesus mean when he says, your brother will rise again?
What does Jesus mean?
What does Jesus mean? Don't overthink this one.
He's going to raise up today.
Yeah, like in an hour or so. We're on the way to do it right now. You're about to see the wonderful power of God on display. What did Martha hear, do you suppose?
Last day.
Yeah.
Prophetic promise.
At most, a prophetic promise. I mean, there's two ways you can take that, and I would like to take it positively, but I'll give you the negative spin in just a minute. At most, it's a prophetic promise, like me reassuring you the dead will someday be raised. Okay? At worst, so everybody here has had someone they love die, I assume at some point in life. We're all old enough to experience that. At that time, did you have any friend or family member give you a cliched answer to that grief? Almost everybody does. It's well-intended. They're not trying to hurt you, but they feel like they've got to say something, and so they say, God needed another flower for his garden, or they're in a better place, or all things work together, and, you know, we'll see him again soon enough. And they're trying to comfort you. I mean, God bless them. They are. And I've done it myself. Again, here I am, the minister gets called in, and I'm supposed to say something helpful, I think. And so I usually say something stupid, is what usually happens, because what do you say to death? Right? It's hard to think of anything really good to say. That's why I steal it. It's really hard to do. So,
in our bereavement group, people who come to us as a group who've lost loved ones, they go through all of those cliches.
Yeah.
And we have found that it's best not saying.
Yeah, and that's hard, but it's better to sit there and be there quietly
Just be there.
than try to pour salve on a wound that's not ready to heal yet. It just hurts. So it's possible. I don't know how to psychoanalyze Martha here, but I wonder how she heard that, because you get her response. I think I've got her on the screen. Yeah. Her response is, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. So again, how do you read that? I'm not going to tell you how to read it. You could read it very positively, and Martha becomes a great woman of faith. I agree. In the resurrection, my brother will come up. Thank you for saying that to me. Or, yeah, I know. He'll come back the last day. That doesn't help me right now. You know what I mean? Like, it just, I don't want to read too much into it, which is why I'm saying it could go either way. But you see how it's a hard conversation to have. Even for Jesus, who is just straight telling her, I'm about to raise your brother from the dead. It's still met head on with grief.
But she responds to that in the very next phrase.
Yeah.
I know that he will rise again in the last day, but it follows that she says, I know that you can do all things.
Yeah, I know you can do all things. Even that's a little open-ended. I mean, did you notice both sisters said, had you been here?
Yeah.
And again, please don't let me read cynicism into the text, okay? Don't want to do that. But is that just a statement of fact, or is that an accusation? I know sometimes when my wife starts a sentence with, if you had been here, it's not a statement of fact, it's, you should have been here. You know what I mean?
Accusation.
And so that, I don't know how to take that. I don't want to read too much into it, but you see how it's just an awkward conversation all the way through, because grief just permeates the conversation.
And it may have been, she doesn't know yet that he can resurrect. She knows that he can heal. So it may be
Yeah.
somewhere in between.
You know, when we say things like, even when we say God can do anything, in our heads we're kind of thinking, God can do anything, I mean,
But
normal stuff, right? I mean, like even in our heads we have reservations about it. And it's, you know, she says, yeah, you absolutely can do anything. I mean, not death. That's been around. No one's beat death. We all die.
When people grieve, they grieve through various methods,
Yeah.
and one of the best examples of a lady's grief is Job's wife. Is probably the best example of grief. Here she lost children too.
Yeah.
Those were her children as well as Job's children.
Yeah.
And yet here's a husband who's sitting in ashes, having to, looks like he's dying because he's covered in boils and that type of thing. And her comment is, curse God and die.
Yeah.
You know, but that's an expression of grief.
Yeah.
Over not only the loss of children, but also you're about to die, you know, and you're not going to live.
Yeah.
And if you think God can get you out of this, well, just curse him and die.
I like that example, and I like the example of Naomi in the story of Ruth, who lost a husband and 2 sons, and just says, your daughter-in-laws, I don't have any more sons for you. Go on back home. I'm going to go to my place and be miserable. You know, I mean, it's just wanting to be isolated, feeling despair. So Jesus' words must have sounded, at least on the surface, like a forced cliche. Maybe not must have. Maybe could have sounded. I just don't know how. I don't know what that relationship was like. Okay. But Martha's response, in my mind, kind of has the hollowness of a person who has suffered very real loss, but feels compelled to accept the kind words of what would be comforter. That's actually what makes the cliches more difficult, because you know they're trying to be nice, and you don't want to say, I want to hear that. So you're kind of forced to say something nice and respond. I'll say this to you, and I'm not going to name any names or tell any tales, but through the last year of Celine's cancer, once in a while someone will say something that they intend to be comforting, and Celine will say, oh, thank you. And then on the way home she'll say, can you believe, you know, it was well intended, but it didn't help, because she was hurt, you know, by the situation she's in. And I'm not just saying that for her. It's every one of us have been in that situation where, yes, thank you for that, you know, is the best we can do. And that's kind of how I feel about this conversation. But here's the point that John wants to make, right? I'm setting it all up because I want you to see it as a very real human situation that you can imagine happening at a funeral. But John's point is something different is going to happen. Wherever Jesus goes, dead people just sit up and start breathing. Like, with the way the Gospels tell the story of Jesus, it's almost like he can't help himself. He raises the dead. Let me give you some thoughts on that. I mentioned that the Lazarus story is only in John. That every single Gospel contains at least one resurrection story. Oddly enough, it never even has to duplicate, right? you can tell a different resurrection story in every Gospel and not run out. So in Matthew, I'll get to a second Matthew example in a minute, but in Matthew 11, the disciples of John come to Jesus and say, John has sent us to ask if you're the one we're waiting for or if we're waiting for another. And Jesus says, tell John what you hear and see. And he lists off a handful of things. And the last one is that the dead are raised up. As if already, this is Matthew 11, this is early in the story. Already, he says, we've already seen the dead get up and walk. What else do you want? As if it were a common occurrence, that you could just, the blind are healed, and the dead rise up. Right? Mark chapter 5 is the lovely account of the daughter of Jairus. This is the little girl to whom he says, Talitha Kumi, which means little girl, arise, and she gets up. And it's a very touching story, well-told story in Mark 5. I like to preach it because it's just fun to do. Really touching. It has the woman with the infirmity of bleeding in the middle of it. So it starts out with Jairus, and then it's interrupted by another miracle. And then when that miracle finishes, somebody walks up and reminds us, we're still in this other story. And someone walks up and says, Jairus, your daughter is dead. And then they go on to the house and she's raised. And it is a beautiful little flow. Anyway, resurrected. And on that one's when they have the argument, you remember? Because Jesus says, well, she's just sleeping. Which is the same thing she says about Lazarus, right? And they said, I think we know what dead people look like. Jesus says, I'll show you. The widow of Nain in Luke 7. Fantastic story. Because this one, he's just walking by town. And out comes a funeral procession. Literally, it's a lady who's known to us simply as the widow of Nain. So she's already a widow. And on the bier they're carrying out is the person described as her only son, her beloved son. Same word used to describe Jesus in John 3:16, the only begotten son. This is my son. This is the one I love. This is all I had. And he's dead. And Jesus reaches up and touches the corpse. Is that something you're supposed to do in the law of Moses, to touch dead bodies all the time? Frowned on, right? It's an unclean thing. He reaches up and touches the corpse. And the boy sits up. Right? He's alive. And then we get Lazarus and John. Like every gospel wants to say, by the way, Jesus was walking by one day and a dead person just stood up. And it's quite frequent when you start thinking about it.
When Jesus died on the cross, the people were raised from their...
That's the one from Matthew. Yeah, I was going to say it, but I'm glad you remember it, because everyone forgets that one. That at the time of the cross, it doesn't say he raised a dead person. It says many of the saints that slept got up and walked around town. And Matthew throws it in like, stuff like that happens. Like, he doesn't even explain it. I want to know what happened later. He doesn't tell you anything else. Just got up, walked around.
Well, the transfiguration is another one.
In a sense, yeah. I mean, you get someone who should be on the other side of the grave, and there they are talking to Jesus, and that's kind of peculiar. Back to John 11 for a second, now that we'll get a little more of what to expect. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, this is now with Mary, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, where had you laid him? And they said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. So the Jews said, see how he loved him. So that's an interesting portrait. We remember this line because it's the shortest verse of the English Bible, right? Jesus wept. So when your teacher said, pick out a memory verse, you said, I got it. John 11. Right? Jesus wept. But there's a lot to it, isn't there? He is a person, even while knowing that he has the power to defeat death and fully intends to, he is still moved by human grief and the tragedy of human death. He is the God of life. And in a sense, there's nothing more offensive to him than death and all that it entails. This is his world that he brought to life. And here he is at a funeral. And it's a funeral of his own friend and the people mourning on his friends. So he's moved, deeply moved in his spirit, greatly troubled. In trouble? Well, what's he troubled by? Is he not sure he can do it? Well, of course, I don't think he has any doubt in what's going to happen. But it's just the fact that somebody died is troubling news.
Could be trouble because they're gonna have to go through it again.
And that they're going to have to go through it again. I heard a sermon one time that said the real reason Jesus is troubled because he knows after this they say, oh, that's it, we've got to kill this guy. And that's how John 11 ends, is that this is kind of like the last straw. This is a miracle you can't sweep under the rug. And so that next day they have a meeting in Jerusalem. This man's got to go. I don't know if that's what it meant, but there's a lot going on in that story, isn't there? They say, see how he loved him. That might have been why he's weeping. But there could have been a lot of reasons, right? But Jesus wept.
I just think that
Yeah.
you say frequently, don't overthink it. I think this is one that we need to not overthink. I think this is so beautiful
Yep.
in its expression of his humanity
Yeah.
that it's just,
It's what we're promised in Hebrews, for example, for the mediator, that he can be touched with the feelings of our infirmities, right? That he is not, if our mediator in worship and prayer was cold and heartless when it came to the subject of death, he said, don't worry about it, you'll be fine. I don't know, what, could I pray to that person when I'm grieving? But Jesus is a person who wept at a funeral. He's somebody you can talk to when you're weeping at a funeral. Yeah.
I could be wrong, so correct me if I am, but if memory serves, this is the only place in recorded history where Jesus cried.
oh, garden.
Depending on what you think in Gethsemane happened, because the language is weird about it's sweat as of drops like of blood, and there's some kind of groaning going on. So again, I'm trying to remember exactly how that's worded, but other than perhaps Gethsemane, I'd have to double check. But yes, this is definitely the only place where it just comes out and said, and he started crying.
So all of these friends of his have never seen him
Yeah.
this emotional, if you
Yep.
will. So we've seen anger,
Yep.
and we've seen the other side of the
Yep.
emotional spectrum.
Yeah. Do you know a really strong person in your life? And then can you think of a time they wept in front of you and what impact that had? I can think of one occasion in my entire life where I remember my dad crying. And that moment is like just etched in my brain, because it's not something that he did often. Yeah. It's a very, as I say, don't overthink it. It's a beautiful passage just all on its own. Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. So it's a cave. It's kind of like what we expect Jesus would have been like. Really a prelude to his own resurrection. It says, take away the stone. Martha's not so sure this is a good idea, right? Just good common sense says this is not how death works. Okay? So again, reflecting on our earlier conversation of what did Martha think when Jesus was talking to her, whatever she expected, this was not it. Right? She's taken off guard. This is a bad idea. He's going to smell bad. Jesus says, did I not tell you that if you believed you would see the glory of God? This is actually what I was talking about. No, it's not what you heard. This is what I was talking about. So they took away the stone. Jesus then prays to the Father, and then with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. Anybody know the name Marshall Keeble? No chance. Church of Christ preacher from ages gone by, and was fond of saying in his sermon on this, Jesus said Lazarus come forth because if he had just said come forth, the whole cemetery would have stood up. He had to be specific. Such is the power of the resurrecting Lord, right? That he commands and people just get up. And he does.
That was a comment by an atheist in a debate with a minister. It wasn't Keeble, but it was someone, and the atheist said, well, why did he have to call his name? Because the reply to the debater was that every tomb would have come out,
Everyone?
or cemetery would have come
Yeah.
out.
Yeah, and I assume that's how the last trump works. So the man who died came out, and again, I love the way that's worded. In case you're not sure, when he said Lazarus, do you mean Lazarus? The man who died, that one, came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips, and his face wrapped in cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Wherever Jesus goes, dead people just sit up and start breathing. It's just who he is. Okay. The Matthew 27 passage, okay, at the time of his own death, after the Lazarus story, the earth shook, the rocks were split, the tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep, were raised and coming out of tombs after his resurrection. They went to the holy city and appeared to me. I want to see the rest of that chapter. I want to know what happened next. And he just says, moving on. It's a strange little passage. I don't know what to think about it. This is even, Jesus had to tell somebody, would y'all move that rock in front of Lazarus' tombs? And this one, the tombs open up. And the resurrection starts happening. Right? I mean, this is a climactic event of some kind. What happened to them? I don't know. Did they walk around and then go back to the tomb? Did they all go back and get their jobs back? I have no idea. Joy knows.
No, I don't.
Oh, okay. You had your hand up. I assume that you're gonna.
Because I think the same thing of like, this is mind blowing, this verse. So we make the assumption that the shroud and the face covering is a normal thing.
Yes.
And Lazarus had to be unwrapped.
Yeah.
So what about them?
Are
Were they raised in the same manner as Jesus
Yeah.
was? Is like, no, it's all there, just nice and folded up. And it's like, yeah.
I
I'll
have
more
so many
detail
questions,
here.
Matthew, and he has no interest in telling me.
But it's
3
like-
days later, on a Sunday morning, Jesus himself revealed his passage from death into life, which is, of course, something we talked about earlier and we talked about at Easter.
It's like I've said in this whole study, this is a new thing.
Yeah.
Everything's new in John.
Yeah.
It's a new thing, it's a new approach to life, it's a new approach to death. It's a new approach to worship, it's a new approach to where and how and do all these things.
I won't repeat this too much, because this is all stuff I said in my Easter sermon, but it was in the book, so I mentioned it. That, as you say, Lazarus was still wrapped in his grave clothes, but with Jesus, he comes out of the tomb on his own power. The shroud is folded up in a little napkin over here, according to John 20 and verse 5, and he doesn't need it. He's kind of laying there. Again, his is this full emancipation from death. Lazarus is like an armistice. It's like a ceasefire with death. Jesus is defeating death. It has lost. And that's what Peter describes in Acts 2:24. God raised him up, loosing the pains of death, because it was not possible for him to be held by it. Whatever holds dead people to the grave, be the linen shroud or the stone in front or whatever cosmic power of death, it was untied. It was undone. The trap was sprung. And Jesus could not possibly be held by that. Jesus is walking, talking, breathing resurrection. Wherever he goes, resurrection just starts happening. So, that passage we read earlier, John 5:24, truly, truly, I say to you, whoever hears my words and believes him who sent me has eternal life. He does not come into judgment, but has passed from death to life. And that sentence, that little bit, is, if you're asking what is the Christian doctrine of the resurrection, which is supposed to be our topic tonight, everybody in the world believes that you live and then you die. Christian believes you die and then you live. That on the other side of death is life more profound, out of the shadow of death, and into something more profound than we've ever had here. And that belief is a game changer. Our story has been reversed. Life is not what we leave behind when we pass into death. Death is what we leave behind when we pass into life. C.S. Lewis has this quirky little sentence. I'm not even sure I half understand it if I quote it right. Something like, die while you're still living, there's no chance after, or something like that. And it's just his way of saying, it's one of those things you do, and then you go to the better thing, If you're trying to live your life, everything you want to do right now, and then one of these days death comes and it's all over, you're kind of in a hurry.
It could be meaning that once you're born, you start to die.
Yeah.
Which is, in a sense, what happens.
He says the goal is to get that death thing behind us. The better part is still to come.
And the
But
older
it's kind of a
you
quirky
get,
way of saying it.
the older you get, the more you realize it.
And how about the rest of that John 5 passage? Having read what we've read already, think about what the sentence means. Truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming and is now here when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of the God, and those who hear will live. And he has power to grant life. That Jesus is consistently, this is 6 chapters before John 11, he's consistently saying, not only will there be a resurrection, because I'm here, it has essentially started. Like you're seeing the resurrection power on display and then perfected. It's coming and it is now here. You hear preachers use a cliche sometimes, and there's a reason to use it. A lot of the promises in the Bible are already but not yet. And what we mean by that is they're already true in a sense that we're enjoying them. And there's more to come. It's more true down the road. And that's the way the resurrection works. So listen to 1 Corinthians 15. For as in Adam all die, so in Christ shall all be made alive, each in his own order. Christ the first fruits, then at his coming, those who belong to Christ. See? Already? Not yet. The hour is coming, and now is. Right? That it's both ongoing and we're waiting. And I know that's frustrating. I want it to be one or the other. Paul says both. Then comes the end, when he delivers the kingdom to God the Father after destroying every rule and every authority and power, for he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet, and the last enemy to be destroyed is death. Like death is lost, but hadn't given up yet. But it's going to lose completely. What does this mean? Christ the first fruits. What that means, in my thinking, there's a lot of things, but one is the resurrection of Jesus is the template for my resurrection. That description tells you what's going to happen to me. I think sometimes we think that his is like a special case, and then mine might be somehow completely different. But it's just simply the first fruit of the harvest. What does that say about the rest of the harvest? It's all of like nature. This is a foretaste of what is to come. Your resurrection will be very much like his. And his, notice he doesn't say Lazarus the first fruits, or the widow of Nain's son, right? There's this little hint of glory. But Jesus actually defeated death in a monumental way. His body got up, never to die again. And then the rest of you, first fruits. Yeah.
I agree with what you just said, but I also think that it references back to God's appointed times, where Jesus fulfills Passover.
Mm-hmm.
What follows Passover is the day of first fruits.
First fruits,
And I
yeah.
think that's directly related. And when you look at that, I mean, it just lines
Yeah.
out the spring, and then the rest of them are about his second coming. And
Yeah, it's definitely a signal word for the
Yeah.
Jewish year of, hey, yeah, this means a thing. Pay
Yeah.
attention. Romans 6, how about this? If we have been united with him in a death like his, we shall certainly be united with him in a resurrection like his. See? Now, if we have died with Christ, we believe that we will also live with him. We know that Christ, being raised from the dead, will never die again. Death no longer has dominion over him. What do we mean? Well, that was accomplished. The defeat of death. For the death he died to sin once for all, but the life he lives to God. So you also must consider yourselves dead to sin and alive to God in Christ Jesus. Already and not yet, right? That because Christ has demonstrated what you will have, you can live now like you're there. You can live like a resurrected person right now.
I love when Joanne is here and she's talking about this because she frequently says, I'm not dying. I've already died. I'm living. And even though she's yet to pass, she doesn't claim that. I mean, she's like, no, it's already done.
Yeah,
And I love that faith that she has.
It's one of the things, because this is Romans 6, 5 through 11. Anyone happen to know what the topic is in verse 4? Baptism. Like as you were baptized into his death, you were raised up, and then it goes on to say all this, right? That the Christians could think, if you've been baptized into Christ, you kind of already got death behind you, which is part of, again, that C.S. Lewis funny phrase, die while you're living, there's no time after, right? Get that death thing behind you and start the continuation of the life to come. It's a beautiful idea. So, already and not yet. In one sense, we await the future resurrection. We're waiting people. We take communion till he comes. We're waiting. And in another sense, it's already started. The first body is out of the grave, never to die again. In a sense, the resurrection has started. Which is why some of the language in the New Testament, you get me off subject now, but end times or last days language is so hard to read because some of it sounds like one of these days. And then some verses sound like right now. Because what was the sign of the end of the age? The resurrection of the dead. That was the one thing they knew from Daniel. When the dead come up, that's the end. And Jesus is already out of the grave. So in a sense, the end has started. Now, none of us probably could have anticipated the end would take 2,000 some odd years and still be going. But that's what Christianity is about, is living out that we've started, we're beginning the end, we're on the way. What Jesus has done, we too will do. Jesus himself is the first of all of God's children who passed not from life into death, but from death into life. I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Okay, I've talked too much. Discussion questions for 10 minutes. These are the ones I had, but as always, you can talk about pretty much whatever you want, and I'll nod and pretend you're on point. No problem. Number one, we find death a very uncomfortable topic for discussion. How does Christian faith help us talk about death? Or does it? Would be another part of that. Number two, what is the importance of the Christian insistence that the body, not just the spirit, will be raised up from the grave? Notice all these stories involve bodies, not casters. Isn't that interesting? And then, how about a C.S. Lewis quote? So I can't help myself. Lewis, in a letter to a friend, wrote, I'm not sure that old age isn't the best part of life. How is the Christian view of life, not just death, changed by the doctrine of the resurrection? That's a pretty optimistic thing that a lot of people don't say. We say, you're only young once, you got to do it all. And Lewis says, this might be the best part. That's a different way of thinking. Okay, any of those, none of those, you got 10 minutes. What do you want to talk about?
I think of Job, who was not Jewish at all, but yet he had a concept of resurrection.
Yeah.
I believe it's in the 30th chapter when he says that I know that I will rise and I will be in my flesh and I will see God.
I'll see God, yeah. I'll wait till my change comes. Yeah. He has some funny lines where, again, he seems convinced. Sometimes it's really open-ended, The one I like in Job is where he said, it may be the same passage, but he says, there is the hope of a tree. If it's cut down, it can live again, and the sprout can come up out of the stump. Mm-hmm. Which is, again, a very folksy way of saying, I saw a tree once cut down, and that stubborn thing wouldn't die. Maybe humans are that way. Maybe God does it again, And it's kind of like poetic musing compared to Paul, but that hope is alive in it. Yeah.
Okay, interestingly, I was listening to a podcast and one of the topics was this, and it brought out that in Jewish sages have taught, and I've heard this elsewhere besides this podcast, that perhaps the reason that Jesus delays to the fourth day is because there was an idea that the Spirit hung around
Yeah.
for 3 days. And
Yeah.
you may have preached that too, I don't remember.
I didn't.
I don't remember.
I didn't mention that, but there is a tradition that's often cited, like I've never been able to find it, like in an old
Yeah.
document, but I've heard it cited several times,
Yeah.
that there was a Jewish tradition that the Spirit kind of hovered over the grave for 3 days.
Yeah.
And so when Jesus comes on, I'm going to wait till day 4 to raise up his friend. It's like, he is completely, utterly dead. No question. Yeah.
I think that's part of number 2, is that there can't be a question. And from the resurrections that had already happened, not resurrections, is raising people from the dead, they were raised physically.
Yeah.
But I do have, and I have to admit, this is a little bit humorous, but it's interesting to me, okay, physical resurrection, I believe in that. Is it gonna be Colin that still has all his hair and his back doesn't hurt? Or is it gonna be the way I was when I died? The Transfiguration doesn't say, yeah, Moses was about 40 years old. He looked like he was 40 years old in the Transfiguration.
So it's fascinating. I have a lot of thoughts about that, actually, because I think it is a good question. Because we all have this question of, what will the resurrected body be? In fact, shall we turn in our hymnals? 1 Corinthians chapter 15, for just a moment. Verse 35, where Paul quotes Colin. 1 Corinthians 15:35, but someone will ask, how are the dead raised, and with what kind of body do they come? You foolish person. It's Paul, I'm sorry, it wasn't me. You foolish person, he says, what you sow does not come to life unless it dies. But what you sow is not the body that is to be, but a bare kernel, perhaps of wheat or of some other grain. But God gives to each body as he has chosen, and to each kind of seed its own body. But not all flesh is the same. But there is one kind of humans, another of animals, another of birds, another of fish. There are heavenly bodies and earthly bodies. But the glory of the heavenly is of one kind, the glory of the earthly is another. And that's astronomer 41 is my favorite. There is one glory of the sun, another glory of the moon, and another glory of the stars, for star differs from star in glory. Some astronomy there. Not even all the stars are the same brightness. And what he seems to be saying is the difference between the resurrected body and your current body is like the difference between a star and the sun. Like, I can say objectively they're basically the same thing. They sure look a lot different, right? It's the difference between a kernel and the whole plant. So is it still Colin? In the same sense that the acorn is still, the tree, right? I mean, it's the same, but so elaborately different. So in the case of Jesus, on the one hand, people keep running into him in John and Luke after the resurrection and don't even recognize him until he says, hey, it's me. On the other hand, he still has scars that he can say, you can touch him if you want. So my best answer to this actually comes from Dr. Baird at OC, because we were musing over this one time, and his comment was, the best parts of you that make you the best version of you is what is resurrected. If being bald makes you the best possible Colin you can be, then you will be bald in the resurrection. If being blind made someone a better human being, maybe they'd be blind in the resurrection. If it's a detriment, right? If it's a crippling, debilitating thing, I don't know how to answer that, but that was his comment. The wounds didn't make Jesus any less; they made him more, and so he kept him. And yet, still, he is transformed into something magnificent.
So what he's saying, in a sense, based upon what you were saying there, what about infants that die?
Yeah.
Are they going to, based on what he said?
Yeah.
That's the best part of them.
That,
being an infant.
infants may be as good as any human ever wanted to be anyway. I've had this question with a family whose child was autistic. And they asked, What is the resurrection like for someone who lived their entire life with a mental impairment of some kind or emotional impairment? I don't know. I'll tell you, I've met a lot of happy autistic people. Like if that is the best version of them, maybe that's who they be. If it's not, if it's debilitating, maybe it's not. I can't answer that. So the other verse I would refer to is 1 John 3.
Whoa.
No, hold on. I can do 1 John 3 and then I'll quit. Verse 2, we are God's children now, and what we will be has not yet appeared, but we know that when he appears we shall be like him, because we shall see him like he is. So John's answer is, whatever it is, it's like the Jesus that came out of the tomb. And John even saw that and still says, I'm not sure exactly what that's going to look like for me, but it's going to be like him. It's going to be the best possible version of whatever I'm supposed to be. I assume it's a bold call. You'll definitely keep your beard. There's no doubt about that. So go ahead, Joy.
Go back to 1 Corinthians 15 and read 42 and 43.
So it is with the resurrection of the dead, when what is sown is perishable, what is raised is imperishable. Sown in dishonor, raised in glory. Sown in weakness, raised in power.
When I've read that before, I've read that as all glorifying and honoring God, which very well may be what it's talking about. I mean, is, but another meaning might also is referencing we are imperishable, which we get, but we're glorified, which we get, and we're raised in power, which, I mean, Jesus obviously had power after, I mean, he could go through walls, you know?
Whatever he does, yeah.
I mean, you know, he didn't do that before he was resurrected. I mean, maybe he did,
Yeah.
but we don't have a story of it, you know, so. And he could fly,
What?
and he could fly.
I've only got 2 minutes left. I don't have time for
He was-
flying Jesus.
he-
What are you
he-
about to tell me?
No, when he ascended.
Oh, he ascended. Okay. I'm with
That
you
sounds
now.
like flying to me.
I had this cape image in my head. I was
Oh, he could float,
float.
okay.
Okay. He can ascend.
Helium Jesus, is that what it is?
Boy, I thought we had gone a whole different direction. You completely fit my brain another way. I'm sorry. Okay. Yes. So yeah, I mean, that the resurrection glorifies us and glorifies God. It glorifies God and glorifying us, right? That the better we are, the more it demonstrates the power and glory of God. And so I think we're going to be magnificent because we're kind of surrounding him and saying, look at what we've done for us. It's going to be great. And I don't think anyone's going to look around and say, really? That version of me? Every one of us is going to say, that's it. That's perfect. That's who I am. That's who I was meant to be. If we had more than 2 minutes, I want to talk more about this body business. I think we have it in our heads that on the way up, again, we transform into Casper, I mean, at some point. And that raises really interesting questions that we're raised into a body. Now, it may be a body that's so fundamentally different that it can ascend and be in the presence of God as it is. This body, I don't think this should be in the presence of God. I think it might just burn to a crisp. But Jesus can just go from here to there and make sense. It raises an interesting question about the world to come, of what God has in store for these bodies he's raising up. But it's good to think about it. Casper's, me being silly, but not merely a spirit, not a ethereal, ghostly existence where you're kind of alive, but boy, I wish I was back on earth in a body. Like, you are more human there than you've ever been here. Yeah.
Well, and it occurs to me that to underscore that, when Jesus says, when he is on the shore and he says, give me a piece of fish to eat, yeah, I'll show you, which gives a whole new understanding of many passages, including Revelation, where this is the great supper of God. This is the banquet. You are,
Are we having dinner? I mean, it sounds like that Isaiah passage that I read for Easter, marrow and well-aged wine. I mean, it's like all food language, which you think, well, it's clearly figurative. And then Jesus eats fish. And oh, well, that's interesting. What does that mean? But again, this is a body. It's a perfect body. Maybe it eats because it likes to eat. Maybe it doesn't need it. I don't know. And it doesn't gain weight. Wouldn't that be something? That would be a glorious body. Yeah. All right, well, we've gone far afield. Are we content then that the resurrection is the promise we have? Yeah. Okay, thanks for your attention. We'll wrap up and try again next week. Somebody want to say a prayer for us before we wrap up completely and leave? Any volunteers? Colin, thank you, sir.
Lord, we thank you for the blessings of this hour and our time together to enjoy one another's company as we study and learn and grow closer to you. We thank you for the blessing of life, the blessing for our resurrected life, and for our Savior. And it's in his name that we pray. Amen.
Amen.